One of the things that my grandfather used to make was decorative chessboards, and I'm lucky enough to have gotten one before they were all gone. I've never made one for myself and always figured that one day I'd get around to it. Another thing that he would make was backgammon boards. I was always amazed at the precision that was required to make such a thing, and pretty intimidated to ever try it for myself. Until now. I'm going to go for it. I put together a design for a chessboard game box that has a little drawer for pieces, some finger grips on the sides for easy mobility, and some decorative edges and splines and trim. But the coolest thing about it is that the chessboard itself can be lifted out and flipped over to reveal a backgammon board, so you can play whichever game you want. Okay, this is probably going to be the trickiest build I've ever done, but I'm up for the challenge. Let's figure this thing out. So to start things off, I wanted to first pick out a couple wood species that would contrast each other quite well. I grabbed some curly maple that I've had sitting around forever, and then I found a big chunk of black walnut that ought to do perfectly. These two woods are often chosen together because of how different they look. It's a pretty stark contrast. It's like when I put down the bananas that I just bought next to the bananas that I bought a week ago and never got around to eating. I put a flat edge on the pieces by running them over the jointer a few times, and then I could set my fence to 1/4 inch, raise the blade up, and slice up these pieces into long strips. And after struggling with some knots and imperfections and cracks, I finally found several maple and walnut strips that will be perfect. Next, I could lower the blade and then cut each of the strips I'll use in the chessboard to their final widths. Then with that done, I could lay them all out on my bench and tape all the seams together. Now with all that held together now, I flipped it over and I could run a bead of glue down the edges. And once I got all the pieces glued, I carefully placed it all into the clamps, tightened it up, and I left it to dry. Later, once it dried, I could take off all the clamps and then take it over to the table saw where I could clean up one of the edges. And after that, I could slice it up into strips again. Now I could spread it out and flip every other one end for end to lay out the chessboard. I lined up each little intersection and I taped it in place, and I did that the whole way across. Then it was just a matter of gluing it up again and dropping it back into the clamps. Then a while later, I popped it out of the clamps. And then gave it a good sanding. Lastly, I could trim one of the sides and then make it perfectly square on the table saw. Then I just set it aside for the time being, and I got to work on the backgammon board. First, I counted up the number of times I've misplaced my tape measure in my shop, and I put that number into my digital angle gauge. I set my miter saw to that same angle, and then I cut this piece so that it matches it. Then I glued on a little right angle stop block with some CA glue. Next, using that same angle, I made another couple cuts and some scraps so that I could make another piece that has that angle cut into it. Then I mounted my jigs onto my cross-cut sled so that I could cut out all the triangles for the backgammon board. Here's how it works. First, I start with a square piece of stock and I put it into the first jig. This cuts the right side of the triangle. Then I move it over and I put it into the second jig. This cuts the left side in. Finally, I stick it up here and I can trim it to length. And here's what I'm left with. Check it out. Perfect angle. Flip it around, perfect angle. Plus, the bottom needs to be exactly 1 1/8 inch across. And perfect. All right, so now I need a bunch of those pieces cut so that I can make a ton of triangles. Once I had them all cut, I needed to figure out the best way to glue them up. And for that, I figured why not risk gluing them directly to my bench, because that'd be hilarious, right? So that's what I did. I made this right angle clamping jig and just lined up all the triangles for one quadrant to the backgammon board. Once I had it looking perfect, I taped it all up, flipped it over, and then added some glue down all the seams. Then I just put it right back into the jig. I tightened it up in there and added some weights so that it didn't bow upwards. And after about 1,000,000 years, I finished all 4 quadrants this way. Next, I could glue together the halves of the backgammon board. Basically, just 2 quadrants and a walnut spacer in between. I taped them up and glued the seams, and then clamped them with the cauls to keep them flat. Afterwards, I glued on a straight edge so that I could flush trim off the excess of the walnut spacer. The last thing to go into the board was the center bar. I was Wenge-ing my options of what species to use, and Wenge I saw this piece, I figured it was definitely the Wenge to go. Whenever I use this wood species, it always ends up looking wing-amazing. However, I have no idea what species it is. Now with both game boards done, it's time to mash them together and potentially ruin all of my progress thus far. I spread a pretty liberal amount of glue onto the chessboard, and once I got it all evened out, I plopped down the backgammon board on top and then brought it over to the bench. From there, I got it all lined up perfectly and then squashed it down flat with some clamps. To hide the edges of the game board, I decided to use some decorative trim. I cut up a bunch of thin strips and then stacked them up to form a pretty neat looking pattern, like this. I slathered a bunch of glue onto the strips and then made a bunch of little laminations. Once I got each one stacked up just right, I stuck them into the clamps and then squeezed them all tight between a couple of boards until they were dry. And when they were, I could loosen up the clamps and then break them free from one another. At this point, they were still pretty rough though, so they needed to be cleaned up over at the table saw. So I trimmed the edges while simultaneously making another blonde curl that I'll use for my Dolly Parton costume. Next, I could use my miter attachment to my crosscut sled to cut the corner angles into the trim. And once I had them fitting nicely around the entire game board, I could tape the joints together, spread some glue, and then wrap it around and secure it in place. Then once it dried, I could trim off the excess and sand everything smooth. Now I can set the game board aside and get to work on the box. You'll never guess how much I paid for this board or why I got it for so cheap. Anyway, I chopped it up on the miter saw into 4 sections and then sent them all through the planer until I got them down to a final thickness of 3/4 inch. At this point, I could rip them down to their final dimensions, but for the front, I cut out a section of the middle, and I chopped out where the opening of the drawer will be using the miter saw. And since I did it this way, when I put it all back together, the seams should disappear in the grain of the wood. Now when that was glued together, I thought it would be neat if I outlined the drawer opening with a thin line of maple trim. I'm curious how this will look once everything is finished. Next, I used a Roman ogee bit to put a decorative edge on the top of the game box sides, and then I could miter them at the table saw. From there, I could tape up the joints, spread some glue, and essentially just fold up the pieces and secure the ends together. Once I had it square, I could wrap a few band clamps around it and cinch it closed until it was dry. I used a rabbiting bit in the router table to carve in a notch for the bottom panel. I started with a shallow pass and then gradually increased the depth of cut until I had it at a 1/2 inch. But since the router bit is round, Naturally, it couldn't get into the corners, so I had to use some chisels to square those up. Then at this point, I began to notice just how fancy this game box was turning out to be, and I really didn't want it to be something that was so nice that I'd never want to use it. So I really needed to introduce some ugly aspects to it. For this reason, I decided that it would be best for me to make the bottom out of OSB. Gotcha. I'm just messing with you. I just wanted to see how many people I could get to yell at their screens in a fit of rage. You'll have to let me know in the comments how I did. Anyway, I made the bottom panel out of black walnut as well, and then I glued and clamped it into place. Next, I glued in the risers that'll hold the game board up at the right height. And then I could use my spline jig to reinforce the mitered corners of the box. Essentially, this jig holds the box at 45 degrees so that I can make a cut across the corners. Then I make a thin strip of maple, which is exactly the same thickness as the table saw blade, and I cut it up into little triangles. These can then get glued into the curves. When they dry, they're trimmed and sanded smooth. These will help the corners from coming apart, plus they look pretty sharp too. Now I can use my box joint jig to make the sides for the drawer. This has to be one of my favorite jigs that I've ever made. Basically, it cuts fingers that interlock into another piece to create a really strong and decorative joint. There's a template on the back of the jig which has notches that an index tab uses for reference. I just continue to make cuts, sliding the carriage over each time. Then when I can't move it over anymore, I lift it up and I move it to the next notch. When I've finished cutting the full width of the piece, I can remove them out of the jig and test fit them together. And what I'm left with is a real snug, precise fitting joint. Once I have all 4 pieces cut, I can get them glued and into the clamps to dry. After that, I added a bottom using the same method I did before, and then I could mount on some drawer slides. And to improve fanciness even more, I was sure to add one of my grandfather's old flathead screws. When the drawer was mounted within the game box, I could center the drawer front within the opening using some playing cards as spacers, and then I could fasten it into place from the inside. Now we need a drawer pull. I've made this exact same drawer pull for a bunch of other furniture I've designed, and I'm going to make it again for this. Basically, I start by using a cove bit in the router, and I cut in the part where your fingers will grab onto. Then I stick the stencil to the front of it using some spray adhesive, and then I just shape it accordingly over at the belt sander and round off the edges to make it all smooth and friendly to the touch. Lastly, I center it and glue it into place. Easy peasy. Now, since I'll want to be able to easily move this piece around, I figured it would be smart to have some kind of finger grips on the sides. I went back and forth on several different designs for these, but I settled on this one because I like how it sort of looks like a strap with buckles. I wanted to put in some plugs for a pop of color, but I couldn't find my plug cutting set, so I had to use my laser to make them. Afterwards, I just dropped a tiny bit of glue into the holes and then mashed in a plug into each one. Lastly, each one got centered and mounted onto the sides of the game box. Now for the inside of the drawer, I wanted to create some organizers, so I made these 2 little trays to hold the checkers that'll be used when playing backgammon or checkers. Also, I wanted to place in some dividers into the drawer so that once the chess pieces are placed in there, they won't be rolling around. One of these little areas could be used for a dice rolling section when playing backgammon. Then, in an effort to earn one more fanciness point, I decided to flock the inside of the drawer. Basically, this is where you spread on some special adhesive over the surface and then puff in a cloud of tiny fibers that stick to it. Once it dries, it makes a soft, velvety, cushioned surface. So after I painted on the glue, I got my flocker and I went to town, puffing all the surfaces, making sure that it all had really good coverage. In my experience, I found you really want to go overboard and put in way more than it can take. Sort of like what I do every Thanksgiving meal. Then, once it's had about a day or so to cure and dry, I can collect all the flocking that missed the drawer, as well as empty out all the loose fibers that didn't adhere to the glue on the inside. I just give it a few love taps on the bottom, and most of it comes raining out. Then, using my air compressor, I spray a very light stream of air into the drawer sections to remove any extra that didn't manage to get glued down. Finally, the tape gets removed and the drawer is complete. Everything gets a good sanding up to 220 grit, and then it's time for finish. For that, I decided to go with the Bee-Nuba wax from Bumbleshoots. This is essentially a carnauba wax and natural oil mixture. It's designed to bring out the best in the wood while offering some long-lasting protection at the same time. The oil penetrates into the wood, bringing out the rich colors, and the wax essentially seals it in. Over time, the surface layer will harden, which prolongs the durability. As for applying it, it's super easy. I just use pieces of my neighbor's clothes that he put out on his clothesline, and I work the finish into the surface. In a few hours, after the oil has soaked in, I can wipe off the excess. Then the next day, I can buff the waxy finish, and it's left feeling as smooth as glass. It's a great finish. If you'd like to try it out for yourself, you can save 10% on your purchase by using the coupon code FISHER10 over at bumbleshoots.com. The last thing to do was to put it all back together. The drawer goes in, the game board gets placed back on top, and the checkers get loaded into their little trays. They're perfectly sized to hold all of them without it being too tight. And with that, it's done. Just check this thing out. I love that pinstripe around the drawer. And those splines sure turned out sharp as well. The finger grips work perfectly too. They're real easy to use, and it helps me move the game box around very easily. The decorative trim around the game board sure came out nice. I think it adds just the right amount of interest. The black walnut and the curly maple of the chessboard really came together looking beautiful. It's got a ton of character. And the flocked drawer with the checker holders and the divided areas for holding the chess pieces adds a whole other level of fanciness. But the best thing about this piece is that the game board can be flipped over so that you can enjoy playing chess or backgammon. And speaking of that, man, it just came out looking so good. The precision of the triangles is eye-catching, and the walnut, Padauk, and the Wenge accents contrasted against the curly maple sure makes it pop. I'm really glad I went with that combination of woods. All in all, I'm really thrilled with how this project turned out. It certainly was a challenge, but in the end, I think I really made quite a showstopper of a piece. If you think you'd like to make this project for yourself, I'll have very detailed step-by-step instructions available on my website for purchase. They're super cheap. At just $5, you can get a great set of plans and be supporting my channel at the same time. So check it out over at fishersshoponline.com. If this was your first time seeing one of my videos, then thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. I have a ton of other videos on the channel that I'm sure you'd enjoy just as much, as well as many more to come. So click that subscribe button if you haven't already so you don't miss any of my future projects. And if you haven't already, be sure to like the video and leave me a comment down below. It goes a long way to helping the video perform well, and if you really liked it, then consider sharing it with a friend. That would help me out even more. Well, that's it for this one. Stay tuned for the outtakes, and until next time, take care, and I'll see you later.
Oh my gosh. This whole thing I didn't even record. Gosh. I'm so bad at this. Alright, well I taped it all. Now I gotta untape it and retape it to show you that I taped it. Stupid. Shoot. I put this on upside down. Wouldn't you know it? So I just got done cutting up this chessboard, and I think I need to start over because I didn't use the micro jig push block, this thing, which supports pieces on both sides. And when I wasn't using it, I was getting burning here on all these strips that introduced a gap. so they won't go together just perfectly, so you can see that gap. And then I switched to it here, and you can see these go together perfectly, plus there's no burning at all. So that stinks. I gotta scrap this and start over. Oh, it's still recording. Krepskis. Crap. I'm cutting these real small pieces, and the last one that I cut slid down between the throat plate and dropped to the bottom of the saw. I can see it. So I'm going to try to get it with some tape, because I don't know of any other way to get down there to get it. So hopefully it sticks onto this tape. Can't quite see. There, I think I'm on it. Does that work? Worked! Awesome.